Hi guys, welcome back. Today should be Wednesday. Um, if you look in your stream, you will see the daily agenda for today. So today I would like for you to be able to try and differentiate between inherited and acquired traits. Now, normally this is something we would talk about for a little bit. I'm going to try and walk you through it a little bit today so that I make sure you understood what you read yesterday when you read Activity 94. So what you're going to have to do today is use this stream, obviously, to go over your answers. We're going to talk about Lamarck and his ideas on acquired traits and why they were actually wrong. And then in your notebooks, I'm just going to have you make a T-chart. So not a lot of writing today, a little bit of listening, but I think you can handle it. So the resources just listed as your notebook, so you can check your answers, the YouTube video that you're watching now, and then your online book if you need to access the reading again. All right, so let's talk about Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So yesterday when you read about him, this is him right here. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came before Darwin. He was one of the early people to come up with the idea that species change, and now we call that evolution. So Charles Darwin was not the first person who came up with the idea that species weren't exactly the same. But remember, the timing was weird and people didn't really want to hear that stuff. But Lamarck was the first, one of the original people in 1801. He was French and he came up with an idea for how evolution happened. And what he thought, if you read this paragraph, he thought that if an organism used a part of their body more, then they could change that and pass that on to their offspring. So you have to realize at the time it seems silly, but people were able to look at their offspring and say, oh, hey, they look like they're related to me, or hey, look, those animals share common characteristics. But they didn't know what DNA was, and they didn't know how genetics worked, and they didn't know how those things got passed on from generation to generation. So when Lamarck suggested that by changing your behavior, you could change what you gave your offspring, that's kind of where he went a little bit off track. But he wasn't completely wrong. Lamarck is famous for the example with the giraffes. So he would say, like, the fossil record showed that giraffes were not always, their necks weren't as always as long. They maybe looked a little bit more like horse. So Lamarck would say that a giraffe stretched its neck and it got just a teeny bit taller, just a tiny bit. And his offspring would be born with a little bit of a longer neck. And then that offspring would stretch a little bit further to compete for food in the trees, and they would pass that on to their offspring. So he thought that animals acquired traits. We're going to use that word a lot. So Lamarck thought that animals could acquire traits in their lifetime and then they would pass those on. So it might look something like this if you were giraffes, or if you're using giraffes as Lamarck's example. He thought that there were originally some short-necked giraffes long ago, and that over many generations they kept stretching their necks to reach the leaves, and eventually they got better. There was this idea that animals were striving to become better or more perfect. And I don't know if you picked it out in the video, but Darwin in the video actually said animals aren't trying to be perfect. They're just trying to survive in their environment. So where Lamarck went wrong was that things that you acquire in your lifetime don't get passed down. They are things that you do to yourself. You're not born with them. The things that you are born with, you inherit from your parents. And we've talked about that. So Lamarck's theory was not accepted. He was shunned by the other scientists. They actually alienated him. And in 1829, he died very poor and obscure. No one really knew who he was. Lamarck didn't come back into play until later after Darwin. So, what I want to do normally in class, what we would do is we would have a great discussion about traits that are acquired and things that happen to you during your lifetime and things that you're born with or inherited. Instead, we can't have that one on one conversation. So, I'm just going to give you some examples and I want you to make a T chart in your notebook. So, your T chart should look like this. I want you to write that acquired traits are traits you acquired during your lifetime. You do not pass them on to your offspring because they're not in your DNA. They're things that you have done to yourself. So they might be things like scars or a tattoo. If I get like a big flower tattoo on my leg, that doesn't mean that my kids are born with a flower tattoo. Same thing with amputations. If I chop off a finger, it doesn't mean that my kids are going to be born with missing a finger, because those are things that happen to you. All right, so I have some other examples. Big muscles if you work out, or skills that you teach yourself, like learning to play the piano. If I learn to play the piano and I'm really good at it, it doesn't mean that my kids will be born being able to play the piano. So that's different. Um, and then acquired traits is associated with Lamarck and his ideas. On the other side is what we've talked about before. Those are your inherited traits. These are Darwin's ideas. Now, he didn't know what DNA was, but he knew that you inherited traits from your parents. So things that you're born with, things that are in your DNA, things like your eye color or your hair color, the one you're born with, not the one you get at the hair salon, your height, your physical features like the shape of your eyes or your body shape in general. We talked about how you get those things and you resemble other people in your family because you inherit those instructions, you inherit that DNA from your parents. So pause the video and take a second and make sure you get those lists added down or written down. If you have any questions about traits and you're not sure which one they would fall into, shoot me an email and I'll answer you and we can talk about it. But it's important to know the difference between acquired traits and inherited traits. Acquired traits are great, but not what causes evolution. Inherited traits and the mutations that occur to those inherited traits are where your evolution actually happens. So take a minute and fix your notebook. Okay, so once you finish with your T-chart, I want you to look at your analysis answers, and I want to make sure that you got the right answers written down. And then I'm going to post the PowerPoint for you as well. So you can use the PowerPoint if you want to double check your notebooks and make sure you have everything. So your first question asked you to compare and contrast Lamarck and Darwin. It recommended a Venn diagram. You might have done a Venn diagram. You might have just written sentences. It's up to you. It's easy for me to do it on the computer, so I made the circles. But what you should have been able to come up with is the idea that Lamarck used acquired traits and thought those were passed on to his offspring. Darwin thought only genetic traits were passed on. Now, obviously, he didn't know the word genetic, but the inherited traits. But what they did have in common, both Lamarck and Darwin did agree that evolution happened. They agreed that species changed over time, and they agreed that that process was really slow, and you could see just teeny tiny changes in every generation, and that evolution didn't happen overnight. So that was a big difference between what other people had thought about species changing. So Lamarck and Darwin were on the same page with the fact that evolution occurs and that it was slow, different in how they explained it. So double check your answers, and when you're ready, move on to question number 2. Now, question number 2, oh wait, let me back that up. So question number 1 had a second part to it, and it was how we know that Darwin's right and Lamarck was wrong. So today we have evidence for Darwin. We have DNA. We can see variation in a population. We can see that species are different and they have certain things that make them better. We can study how genes are inherited, and we know how those things work now. So Darwin came up with that idea without knowing any of those things, which is pretty amazing. We now have evidence to back up Darwin's idea. Lamarck's ideas don't hold true. We know that if I dye my hair purple, my kids are not going to be born with purple hair. So because we can see those things, that helps to prove Darwin wrong. Okay, or I'm sorry, it proves Lamarck wrong. Darwin is correct. So, question number 2 asked you to use Lamarck's theory, which remember is the wrong theory, not the right theory. To use Lamarck's theory to explain how elephants' trunks have gotten longer. So, in the fossil record, we can see that elephants had much shorter trunks, and over many generations, their trunks have gotten longer. So, what the question wanted you to do was to explain what could have happened to the elephants using the wrong theory. What would Lamarck have said? So Lamarck would have said something like this. He would have said that there was an elephant with a short trunk, and that elephant couldn't reach leaves or couldn't reach the water, whichever. And so he stretched his trunk just a teeny tiny bit so that he could get more water or food than the rest of the elephants. So the elephant stretched his neck, and his babies were born with trunks. I'm sorry, not necks, trunks that are slightly longer. And then those baby elephants and adult elephants stretch their necks a little bit more. And so the next generation was born with even longer trunks. And so on and so forth until after many, many generations, all the elephants had long trunks. That's what Lamarck would have said. Now, some of that is right. It took many generations for the elephants to change. It took a really long time. But if you stretch something, you don't pass it on to your offspring. And I always think of, in history class, you've probably learned of the Egyptian families that put like the plates on their neck and stretch their necks to make them look nice and long. If I do that, my kids aren't going to be born with a long neck. Or how about ear gauges? If I put an ear gauge in my ear and I stretch my ear out really big, it doesn't mean my kids are going to be born with these big gauge holes in my ears. And that's because I'm just acquiring something in my lifetime. I'm not changing my DNA. So that's how Lamarck would have explained the process. On Friday, you're going to do a graded analysis for me, and you're going to have to explain to me how Darwin would explain that process. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Darwin tomorrow. And make sure you understand his concept of inherited characteristics and how that applies to natural selection. And then I'll see what you can do in a graded analysis. So for today, you were supposed to check your analysis, make your T-chart, and that's it. I didn't want to give you much more than a half hour to do, so we should be right around that time period. Don't forget, if you're confused about anything, shoot me an email and I would be more than happy to answer your questions. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. You guys did a really nice job with the exit ticket. I finally got most of you, and I hope that you got your feedback for questions that you got wrong. If you are ever not getting the things that you think you should be getting, don't wait. Send me an email and I'll get back to you and we'll fix it early rather than later. Okay? I hope all is well, and I will chat with you tomorrow. Okay, sounds good, guys. Thank you.